We've been asked this evening to talk about the subject from a personal perspective. So I'm going to try and share some personal views about the subject matter. And I don't want this to sound like a rehash of the presentation that I did at the manifesto launch. So I haven't got a massively prepared presentation. I just want to share some experiences with you. And I'm more than happy, obviously, later on to answer any questions that you've got. So in some ways, I'm posing as many questions here as I'm answering, okay? And I'm very happy to talk about that. I always say about change that I feel that David Attenborough actually has a lot to answer for in terms of business strategy because of his amazing presentational style and because of his own personal gravitas. He's kind of given us all the impression that evolution will always happen and innovation is always good. I think from a business perspective, we actually know that without a lot of thought and without leadership, then that can very definitely not be true. And if you've been somewhere like Madagascar, which happens to have been a trip that I've been on, and you see some of the lemurs that have developed there because the island's been separate from the mainland for like 70 million years, you get lemurs there that are so precisely adapted that they can only survive by eating a very precise type of bamboo, which of course in today's world is just about to disappear completely. And let's face it, we've all got examples from our own life, like kind of perms and culottes. So we do know that in fact innovation doesn't always take us in the right direction. So I think it really does matter when you take on a new role. It matters who you are and what you're bringing with you from your own experience, but it also matters very much what the organisation is like that you're joining and where they are in their evolution, if you actually want to put it that way. So I thought I'd look at it from those two perspectives, and rather than the formidable business leader side of things, I thought I would actually share with you some examples of the things that I've done in the past so that you can sort of think what someone like me might just walk into any organisation and sort of be how I would be looking at things. Change has been my career. I didn't set out to do that. It's just something about me that means that I don't like things to stay the way they are. I joined the Lloyd's market in the mid-80s, and I can see we're out, there's very young people, but I can also see that there's some older people here. So you'll remember that, you know, the mid-80s, Margaret Thatcher hadn't long been there. The whole concept of the UK being a service-based economy was very, very new. We'd moved out of the 70s where everything was about the public sector, highly unionised, you know, no service businesses, it's all about manufacturing or utilities, that kind of stuff. And then suddenly, bam, my generation, all of us wanted to go into investment banking, we wanted to go into management consulting, we wanted to go into IT, we wanted to go into advertising. That's what all my friends were doing. And then yours truly comes and works in the insurance market. So I was very lucky. I joined quite a sort of go-ahead, progressive sort of Lloyd's business, which is now called Hiscox. And I was very lucky that my original boss had just started specialising in a form of insurance that was quite new, which was professional indemnity. But the established view of that was it was all about the traditional professions. So there were only 25,000 people working in the traditional professions. I'm exaggerating, but maybe 100,000 people working in the traditional professions. So that was it. And 3 or 4 people in the Lloyd's market had kind of cornered that market. So that was the end of the story as far as the market was concerned. And probably conservatively, 100 million of premium income, something like that. So that was the environment that I came into, and I was asked if I would specialise in that market sector. So I looked around and I thought, I mean, we talk about the soft market. Well, there was already a really soft market there because there was this idea, it was only a limited number of clients, only a limited amount of premium income, 250,000 people already in the space. So I'm looking up and going, with the arrogance of youth as you do, I'm going, well, I'm not going there. But what did I bring? The fact was all of my friends were going into all of these new areas. So all I really did was to think, not going there, look outside, where's the customer need, where's the new customer, and what's it about? So of course I came back into the market and then said, right, what we do need PI, but we need PI for IT companies, media companies, management consultants, service-based businesses, right? So I was lucky that Hiscox actually thought that was, I'm not sure they kind of thought anything really, but they just thought, oh, well, if we let her do that, that will shut her up. So I was allowed to kind of get on with that. And because it was different and because it was new, it got a lot of attention. But the real thing was, I was also incredibly lucky because those businesses just went off like gangbusters. So all of a sudden, my little idea actually turned into something which actually was very significant from a commercial perspective for the business that I was working for, right? So I kind of early in my career, I had that happen to me. And if I'm honest, I attribute that more to luck than to anything else, and luck and timing. But I think probably I did at least give something new a go, as opposed to just sticking to what was already there. Okay, so that was the first one. Then I actually, and this is, you can be completely mad in this world. So just as Hiscox, of course, was about to be incredibly successful, I actually decided to leave, having lived with it through some quite difficult times. And what do I leave to do? I leave to do an entrepreneurial startup where there were 4 of us who actually were quite senior market executives. And on the first morning, we're in this office going, what the have we done? And also thinking, oh, how do I plug in my computer? Because I have no staff to actually do the stuff for us. And at the end of the first day going, how do we do the post exactly? How does that work? So that gives you an idea. So there's this lovely idea that all entrepreneurial startups are set up by people who really, really know what they're doing, but actually, lordy, no, they're not very often. But again, we had this idea that, well, if you think about the timing, so this was like 2003, so there'd been a massive contraction in the market for insurance for SMEs, or capacity for SMEs, particularly in respect of liability insurance, largely because the results had been absolutely horrible, so it was perfectly understandable why. And what we had to find was a new way forward for a new business, and what we spotted was the opportunity to bring new capital into that market, because the Munich Re were actually looking for a way to get into the UK market. And then we understood the SME market, and we knew that there was no capacity for liability. And really this whole idea of creating an MGA, I'd love to say we invented it, but it was really an idea of how on earth do you bring 2 parties together who don't actually know how to meet? And there was no language in this country, there was in America, but here there was no language around doing that. So when you can imagine, we were going along to explain to people what we were doing, and they were going, well, what is that? Is that a broker? Is that an insurer? And we're going, no, it's this kind of, when you're doing that and you're sort of like, and that's where actually using this terminology, the MGA in the UK, came from, was sheer frustration on our part, because we couldn't actually explain to people what it was that we were actually trying to do, right? So we then decided, so having done that, which was a business called Oxygen, and then we had an MGA, very original MGA business called OIM. We actually had to create some language around it. So the reason that we decided to set up the MGAA was actually, again, was sheer happenstance, because if you don't have a name, how can anybody identify you? And if you don't have a voice, how can they be interested in what you have to say? So a group of us kind of sat down one day and said, right, we haven't got a name and we haven't got a voice. So how are we going to actually do something about that? So we had this mad idea of setting up a new trade association, which is kind of what we then went and did. All right, so that's, again, you look back on it and you say, wow, you know, look at what's come out of that, right? But but a lot of it at the time was actually just trying to be practical about the situation that we were in. So what did we then do? So we actually sold OIM to Gallagher's, and everybody went, well, what? I mean, Gallagher's, who the hell are Gallagher's? Who are they, right? So why did we, you know, we had people talk to us from Willis, we had people talk to us from Marsh. So why did we sell our business to Gallagher's? We had people talk to us from the big insurers. But again, we were looking at outwards and saying, if you want to do volume business, you've got to have distribution. That's one of the things we'd learned from creating an intermediary business, was you've got to have distribution. And also, if you're going to be an MGA, you've got to have some clout, because you've actually got to go and get a big insurer to give you their capital, or you've got to go and get a capital provider to give you capital. And then what's the most difficult part? It's not actually the policy, it's not actually the underwriting, it's the claims, right? Because if you don't control the claims, you can't control the loss ratio, and if you don't control the loss ratio, ultimately you're sort of doing this in the middle of the market, okay? So what we did was we said, which intermediary organisation, A, needs to go somewhere, and then has these elements about it. And when we looked at Gallagher's, we looked at their business in the US, and we realised that they had a broking business, they had a MGA business, they had a claims business, blah, blah, blah. So what looked to everyone looking at it purely from this market perspective looked like a completely mad decision for us to sell this business to these funny American people. Actually, if you looked at it from the customer perspective, actually made a great deal of sense. And as they say, you know, obviously good or bad, you know, Gallagher's are now massively positioned in the international market as well as in America, and obviously are now fully regarded as part and parcel of the UK market. But if you look back, you know, you only have to look back 7 or 8 years, and actually they weren't. And arguably their buying of an MGA business was actually something which kind of glued together all of the other things that they were actually doing. Okay? So what's the so what of that? Well, that's to say, clearly, any organisation which I join, you know, needs to expect that something's going to change, because why would you employ me, you know, if you didn't actually want to change something? Okay, so that's what I bring to the party. Why would the CII therefore, or why would the board of the CII therefore want somebody like me to come and join it? So this is an very interesting organisation, so totally different to anything I've ever been part of before. It's actually been in existence since 1890-ish. It's got a royal charter from 1912. The dear old girl building that it's actually in, over in Aldermanbury, built in 1935. Great legend around it that it was actually built to be fire resistant, so it's actually built of concrete. It's not in fact built of stone as you'd expect. And there's a great story, because if you think about the firestorm that happened around St. Paul's because of the bombing, you know, the incendiary bombing from the Germans. Actually, there's a story about the fact that the caretaker of the building was actually stood on the roof of the building while all of this was going on, and actually kicking the incendiary canisters off the top of the roof. And it is absolutely true that if you look at the photographs, the day after all of this bombing, there's St. Paul's and there's the insurance hall. And I always just think that's a sort of funny little anecdote about the survivability or the necessity of insurance. Okay, but that's it, you know. So it's a sort of fortress type organisation. The insurance world has gradually moved out of where it is into EC3. it's a building that was built to defend itself as opposed to be open and accessible to, it's got small windows. So everything environmentally about the organisation is the exact antithesis of kind of what's going on in the world. And yet my predecessor has left me, with an organisation that's actually in pretty good financial shape, which he didn't inherit, so he's done that in the last sort of 10 or 15 years. And he's also left me with, in terms of a membership organisation, one of the biggest professional membership organisations in the world. So we've got 125,000 individual members. And it's also an international organisation. So we've actually got quite a lot of members overseas. If you think about the period when it was set up, you can understand why that might be the case. So we've also got operations in India. We actually run the Insurance Institute of Hong Kong. And we've actually got a very good relationship with the regulators in the Middle East, which is all largely due to history. So if you look at the way business schools talk about change, I've got absolutely nothing to change. There's no burning platform. We make a profit. We've got lots of customers. Arguably, we're in a slightly monopoly position because not everybody has got a royal charter which allows them to give out chartered designations. So why on earth would the board actually want to come along and talk to someone like me? And I think that's because if you don't evolve, you die. And a number of things have come out in the organisation. So there was a staff survey which said, we don't know why we're here, right? And then there was a membership survey which said, the members aren't quite sure why you're there. And then there was a CEO survey which said, well, we quite like them, but we're actually not really sure why we're there. And can you see that that might be the kernel of something which is really odd? Because you could ignore it, but that's telling you something, isn't it? And I think that's basically what the board started to do. So effectively, what I went in there to do was to work out why this might be the case. And the most obvious thing when I walked in, not really knowing any of the people very well or anything like that, was there was a complete absence of a why. And if you think about that, if you have an organisation where there's frenetic activity, which there is at the CII, there's a lot of stuff going on, there's loads of exams and blah, 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 but if there's no why, how do you, what do you hang all of that on? And if you're, I don't know, if you're at a party and somebody says to you, well, what's that all about then, right? What can you say? So there definitely was a need to ask that question. And I was very fortunate that the board had already decided they did want to ask that question, and also they already decided that they did want to use some pretty sensible people, as in PwC, to actually help us ask that question. And largely, not to ask the question, but to go out and talk to lots of other people about why this was important. So they did obviously do, lots of surveys. And do you know what, frankly, I'd almost had to work out the answer for myself, because of course as soon as you start as CEO for any business, people want to interview you and they expect you to talk about the organisation as if you've been there for 20 years and you've only been there 2 weeks, right? So you have to work out pretty quickly a dialogue for yourself as to how you're going to talk about something. And being me, of course, I went straight to the why, so I created a why, okay? But then when PwC came in, they actually laughed about why I'd created, because the strategy partner there, he said normally his most difficult job is this idea of coming up with a killer purpose, because if you think about what most organisations do, really all he's got to work out is, okay, they need to produce more widgets more cheaply at a higher margin and therefore raise the revenue and everyone's happy, okay? Professional body, not-for-profit, membership organisation, supposed to be there to, in the public interest. What's that all about? So he was actually anticipating that this was going to be an incredibly difficult thing to do, and obviously I wasn't going to disabuse him because I was fascinated as to what he would think. But he did say in the end that it was the funniest job he'd done in many ways, because actually it was right in front of us what the why was, because we've got this charter from 1912 which actually says exactly what we're there to do: secure and justify the confidence of the public in insurance. And and frankly, unless we actually wanted to fold it up, go back to the Queen and say, do you know what, love, sorry, actually we've changed our minds, we don't actually want to do this anymore, that was it. So so answering the question about the why, in a funny way, you'd say, well, that's really why they put you in there. Well, no, it's not really, is it? Because actually the why for us is really, really clear. So what is it about then, if it's not about the why? Well, what's very clear is that if the organisation itself has actually lost the why, probably there's something about, shall we use the word culture? Something has happened, hasn't it? Because otherwise, how do you lose the why in your organisation? And we're not alone in this. There's a really famous, they always tell this story at business school, because there's a really famous case from years ago when the Americans first had management consultancies. And there was a big company called Nabisco. I don't even know if it still exists, but it was, basically it produced the tins of stuff that you bought in the supermarket. And somehow or other, because they made so much money, they just made more money than they knew what to do with. So they started investing. They bought hotels. They did this. They did that. And in the end, they were all over the shop, and they actually had no idea really who they were, what they were doing, whatever. So they employed one of these new things called a management consultancy to come along and answer this question for them. And as I say, it's a business school case, because after spending, say, I pick a number out of the air, but say it was $250,000, what they came up with was, we're Nabisco, we make biscuits. Right, now that sounds like a really weird thing, but that was the point. The bit they'd lost sight of was the fact that what they were actually there to do, was actually to make biscuits. But if your organisation has lost sight of that, if you think about it, would you still be employing the kind of people who make really good biscuits? Probably not, because by then you're employing the kind of people that know how to buy hotels, or the kind of people that... So your whole organisation, by going off track from what its real purpose is, actually loses the sort of shape of its organisation. So I think what's happened with our organisation is that we've retreated from the charter, which is really all about public interest, and we've gone into this sort of stasis mode around qualifications. So we're just there to run exams and not to talk about standards, not to talk about anything like that. And so we've got a lot of people in the organisation who are very good at producing, marking, assessing, accrediting qualifications. But what we're really there to do is to ensure public trust in insurance, because without the sector having the public trust, there's so much stuff that it's so self-limiting, and it's very different for the sector. So the challenge for me actually is not that there's anything wrong with what the organisation's doing, but it's shrunk back from the actual purpose that it's got. So a lot of what I've got to do is work out, without employing, because that's the wrong thing, it's not about needing more people. It's about working out how you change the culture of the organisation back to facing outwards and saying, this is actually a public, we're here for a public objective, and we've got to talk openly, we've got to be open for business. So we're talking about being open for business. And the first stage of this was really twofold. One was to stop saying to all our stakeholders and people, we've got all the answers and we're just going to tell you what you need to do, because you can see how that happens. And the idea is, so we've created this language around your CII, so not our CII, your CII, so that's the first thing. And then actually I'm going to point to the sign over there, because the second thing on that is just the we call it turning the telescope around. And I tripped over a really good way of giving an example for that right as I came in, because we had something called the Directors Steering Group So you can see DSG, right? And of course, what that had lost sight of was it was actually there to get stuff done. So to actually, make things happen. So what we did was literally by changing the 2 letters around, you can work out for yourselves, it's now known as the Get S Done group. And you know what? That simple change in terms of just turning those 2 letters around has actually meant that an awful lot of stuff has happened in a very short space of time. And some of you will have seen some of the result of that, obviously with the manifesto launch from last week. So hope that's a little bit of, rather than giving you a load of corporate speak, that's a little bit of personal sharing. And as I said, later on, happy to take any questions.